So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Craig Miller and I work for NCFE as a relationship manager within the Endpoint Assessment team. Just to give you a little bit of background on who I am and what my experience is, I've worked within the apprenticeship sector for just over 8 years now, starting off in sort of as a mentoring role for apprentices within employment locations, then moving on to actually delivering apprenticeships from a training provider perspective. And obviously now working at NCFE, supporting those who are delivering the apprenticeships in sort of getting those best outcomes for the apprentice and understanding assessment plan requirements and looking at sort of the end-to-end journey of the apprenticeship and providing guidance on how to get the best from those. Like Martin's just said, what we're going to be having a look at in this session is sort of how to engage with employers and how important that is in regards to the success of an apprenticeship. So just to give you a bit of an idea, we're going to be having a look at the importance of strong relationships, how to build those relationships, key milestones for the employer's awareness, and a summary of advice. And then we'll also open the floor up for questions as well, just in case anyone wants to ask questions around what's being discussed. That'll be an opportunity as well. So employer engagement has a huge impact on the success of an apprenticeship. If the employer is actively involved in that journey and the development of that person, the apprentice will commonly achieve higher grades across their apprenticeship and achieve better and develop more knowledge, skills and behaviours throughout that apprenticeship journey. So having that employer engagement throughout the end-to-end part of that apprenticeship is vitally important for the progress of that apprentice and the development of that apprentice and the opportunities and doors that that opens in the future. And where the employers lack that engagement and aren't as involved in the apprenticeship, obviously does make that apprenticeship itself more challenging, not only for yourselves as a training provider from the lack of support, but also for the apprentice as well. So what we're going to be looking at is just some of the key areas that help to build those strong relationships. And I think the first one is a pretty obvious area, which is communication. Obviously, we all know that communication in any relationship is a key factor in developing those, whether that is in family or friendships. And it's no different when it comes to building relationships with employers. That communication is a vital part of that relationship. Having that effective communication allows the employer to understand the requirements of that apprenticeship, understand what their purpose is in that journey. And I think one of the main challenges that people experience is employers don't always understand what they're meant to be doing to support an apprentice. And that's where sort of you communicating with that employer and having those conversations can help sort of enhance that apprentice experience and enhance their engagement throughout that journey. And I think one of the key things here is just about having several opportunities for conversations to take place. And what I mean by that is having sort of multiple access points, such as phone calls, emails, conference calls, those sort of things with employers, just to get that engagement and show that you are an open training provider who's happy to have those conversations and support that employer in delivering that apprenticeship, because the employers need that support. As Saf mentioned earlier, training providers are seen as the fountain of knowledge for apprenticeships. And yes, to an extent, training providers are those experts in those apprenticeships, but there are also going to be times that employers ask questions that you might not be fully certain on. So obviously in those situations, it's just taking those queries away and reassuring the provider that, reassuring the employer, that although you haven't got the answer then and there, you can get the answer for them. So it's important that they have access to those various communication methods so that they know they can get that support when it's required. Because you are seen as that fountain of knowledge, they will come to you with those questions to get that further understanding and see how they can better support their apprentices in their achievements. It also helps that with the employers feeling like they can reach out, because it's not uncommon that through no fault of the provider themselves, employers feel like they can't always reach out for support. And it's not because of any barriers that are put up from the training provider or anything like that. It's normally based upon sort of past experiences with other training providers, or just sort of feeling like they don't want to admit something is wrong or they don't know something. So they have that hesitancy about contacting for support. But by actively engaging that communication and opening those doors, it's making the employer clear that they can contact you for that support, and they can gain advice and information from you to support that apprentice. When the communication's taking place, it's important that it's taking place with the right people as well. So it's important that at the earliest stage of the apprenticeship, you find out who you need to be communicating with in that employer, because it's no good communicating with the initial person that gets in contact if actually they have limited interaction with that apprentice, because they need to be aware of certain requirements, but it's actually that workplace mentor or line manager that would need to be aware of the apprenticeship. So it's having those meaningful conversations in the correct places as well. Because the right people need to know that information in order to enhance that apprentice's journey and development of their knowledge, skills and behaviours for the apprenticeship standard that they are undertaking. One of the other things that's just as important as the communication is that the onboarding and induction process of the apprentice, because this is the stage where you can set expectations of everyone involved. If they're not set at this stage and the employer's not made aware of their responsibilities in regards to the apprenticeship, you will have difficulty later down the line in engaging them and getting them involved with what they're required to do. So it's important that those relationships in this early stage is sort of the crucial part of that apprenticeship journey to get that point across as to who is sort of responsible for what area. By having this effective induction and onboarding process, it provides the employer with all of that information at the start. And a lot of EPOs or endpoint assessment organisations will have support materials that you can use to support with that, and information, advice and guidance documents that you can use and utilise within those early stage meetings to help the employer understand the requirements of that apprenticeship and what that apprentice is expected to go and be doing over the course of that 12, 18, 24 months. And it also provides the employer sight of what they're responsible for as well. So if they need to take part within reviews, for example, you're setting that out from the start. If they need to produce certain evidence to support that apprentice's achievement, again, they're aware of that from day one. Whereas if you leave that until sort of further down the line when that's needed to be produced, and all of a sudden you get in touch saying, actually, we need a witness testimony for X, Y, and Z, they're going to be more resistant to that and less likely to support or as detailed support. Whereas if you've communicated that right from the outset and they're expecting to have to do that piece of work, then what you've got is an employer who's engaged and proactive with that endpoint assessment requirement. And again, it's about encouraging that involvement of the employer from a workplace mentor or coach's point of view as well, because it's vitally important that that apprentice has someone in their employment location to support them, whether that is a mentor coach, that may be their line manager, it may be a fellow experienced colleague, it could be anyone, but it is important that they have access to that workplace mentor or coach. And the purpose behind that is, as the training provider, you are there to ensure that the apprentice is developing their knowledge and implementing those skills and assessing the implementation of those skills. But what the employer representatives can do is take that knowledge that you are training the apprentice in and help that apprentice to implement that into their working practice. Obviously, you can give them tips around that, but actually that workplace mentor plays a crucial role in regards to the implementation and development of the skills and behaviours aspects of the standard, because you are there to support them in the development of the underpinning side of things and then put it into practice in their employment. In regards to the knowledge, skills and behaviours that were discussed there, the apprentices might not necessarily have the perfect role to demonstrate all of those. And having that conversation at this early stage allows the employer to be aware, right, so actually, in regards to this standard, the apprentice doesn't currently do this within their role. However, what we can do is provide them with this opportunity by asking them to do this activity. And that'll then allow them to demonstrate the competencies in that area as well. Whereas if that's picked up later down the line that actually 9 months into the apprenticeship, the apprentice doesn't do this, then actually the apprentice is going to be more reluctant to sort of allow them the opportunity to develop that knowledge, skill or behaviour. Whereas if that's highlighted as a risk right at the start of the apprenticeship based upon your skills scan and conversations with the apprentice, then actually the employer is going to be more engaged to allow the apprentice that opportunity to develop and be aware of what adaptations they might need to make to that apprentice's role to support them in developing the full breadth of the standard. And just like the KSBs, it's also important to discuss that endpoint assessment. At NCFE, what we always say around apprenticeships is start with the end in mind. Because the endpoint assessment is that ultimate goal, that's where you want to be. That is your ultimate plan, is achieving that apprenticeship, is completing that endpoint assessment successfully. So it's important that when you're in those early stages, you discuss that endpoint assessment, because that is the ultimate goal, like I say, and what you are doing throughout the duration of the apprenticeship is setting little goals and little training tasks to ultimately achieve that end point. And it's important to start with that endpoint assessment in mind and think about what assessments that apprentice is going to be undertaking and how they're going to be sort of assessed within those methods, and thinking about how can you embed that within their on-programme learning and how can that employer support with that. So whether they have an interview, for example, as part of their EPA, discuss that. The employer can conduct sample interviews with the apprentice and discussions and ask them more formal questions in a more formal environment, just to prepare them for that assessment when it comes. And by having those conversations again early on, it just helps the employer understand what they can do as a provider of support for that apprentice in regards to the apprenticeship journey and the achievements of that apprentice. And then early engagement. So this is touching upon what I was just saying there around having the end in mind. And it's beneficial that that end point is the early stage conversation, really, and that you use guidance materials that are produced by the allocated endpoint assessment organisation to support those conversations. So, for example, at NCFE, we produce things like solution briefs, why NCFE, and things like that for the different apprenticeship standards. And they are just small documents rather than the assessment plan, which is obviously quite a lengthy document. The solution briefs are just a brief couple of pages just to highlight those. And other endpoint assessment organisations will have similar documents that are available. So utilise those in those conversations just to inform the apprentice what's happening in the employer. And then it's also about the inclusion. So including the apprentice and employer throughout that full journey, making sure that they're taking part in conversations that need to happen, such as those reviews, which also leads into the check-ins as well. Because it's important that those open communications take place and provides yourselves, the employer and the apprentice, with that opportunity to discuss any specifics in regards to that apprentice's development. And if they are facing any challenges or there's any difficult situations that have arisen throughout that period of review, then obviously you can work with the apprentice and employer to support them in that workplace environment to achieve. And that may be that actually you need to have a conversation around potentially allowing the apprentice access to other responsibilities to demonstrate those. We know that employer locations can massively vary. So someone doing one role in one employment can be doing something completely different in another. And it's important that the apprentice sort of has access to that full breadth of the standard. And obviously those reviews are part of the ESFA requirements anyway, so they must take place. And that's where, like I say, you can request further employer involvement, or the employer involvement can gain support from you as well, because that's the way that this relationship works. It shouldn't just be sort of you doing all the training and the employer sort of just sitting back in a sense. It needs to be active participation on both sides of the apprenticeship, because the employer is vitally important in that success. And like I mentioned earlier, where employers are involved in the apprenticeship program and the delivery, the outcomes of the apprenticeship are much better than sort of where the employer hasn't engaged and hasn't supported the apprentice as much. So it's important that that conversation takes place as early as possible. What you'll notice is that basically everything we've discussed is all centered around communication, which is obvious because communication is that key part of a relationship. But it's important that those other areas are also done, such as that effective onboarding process, because it provides that employer the right information at the right time. And just have a quick look at sort of the importance of the strong relationships with the employers. So obviously open communication is important, and by utilising those tips to build the stronger relationships, employers do feel more able to have that open conversation and will engage within the apprenticeship journey. It enables them to feel like if they do have a query or a concern or they're facing any challenges, that they can come to you as the apprenticeship provider and ask for experience based upon that situation. It also enhances the trust and confidence within you. So the employer, by having that communication and by you being there for support and being able to answer their questions and provide them with the guidance, helps build their trust and confidence in you as a training provider, and means that they feel more confident that you are the right person to support their apprentices because you are actively engaging with them as well. Having that confidence throughout the journey then again leads to successful outcomes for the apprentices and helps keep them involved throughout that journey. And it also helps increase the awareness of the apprenticeship requirements. So by having those open conversations, being open to questions from the employer, allows them to have access to further support and gain more information around what the apprenticeship requirements are. So what's involved in that endpoint assessment? What does my apprentice need to do in order to get to that gateway phase? How can I support my apprentice to achieve the best of their ability? And increasing the awareness of the apprenticeship requirements is the best way to do that. And having those open conversations and reviews around it is one of the key parts of that journey, like I say. And then it's looking at enhancing the development for the apprentice as well. So by engaging with that employer, like I mentioned before, they can be given access to further opportunities to further enhance their knowledge, skills and behaviours. And that's what's going to help apprentices go from getting a pass in their endpoint assessment to getting distinctions. And obviously that is what we all want at the end of the day for apprentices. We want the best of their abilities to come out in that endpoint assessment. And that leads on to the higher achievement rates. Like I say, ultimately, having those better relationships is proven to have higher achievement rates for those apprentices because the employer is providing them with the support that's required around those different areas. And just some of the key milestones for awareness really is just around sort of the onboarding and induction process, as I've mentioned earlier, those review periods, completion of on-programme requirements. So the employer and apprentice should be aware of roughly when do we think that these apprentices are going to be completed their on-programme requirements. So if they've got a diploma, when's that expected to be finished? When are they expected to complete their functional skills? When are they expected to complete any other sort of additional qualifications, such as safeguarding, paediatric first aid, whatever that may be, when are they expected to achieve those as well? It's important about the employer contributions for EPA, such as what I mentioned earlier. If they need to do witness testimonies or observations or anything like that, they need to be aware of when they're expected to take place. When are we meant to do these? Are these meant to be done straight away? Are these meant to be done 9 months down the line? They need to be aware of that so they can plan it. And like I said before, if they aren't aware, they're going to be more reluctant to take part within those. And then finally, it's the gateway meeting and the expected EPA dates. So the employer needs to be aware of sort of when the apprentice is expected to go through the endpoint assessment and have that gateway meeting and be declared ready. And then it's also important that they're aware of when the endpoint assessment is going to take place, and the assessment methods will be conducted so that they can make resource within their working environment for that. So if they need to have someone available to cover the apprentice, they can get that arranged. And it just means that it's having as little impact on the organisation as possible for the apprentice completing them. So just a summary, open and effective communication is key. Arranging the check-ins with the employer during the apprenticeship delivery is vital, as it provides those opportunities to have those open conversations. Having that early engagement helps build those strong trust and relationships, because that early engagement is the most vital part of the apprenticeship. And then having them involved in all aspects of the apprenticeship journey, from induction right through to endpoint assessment. So I've just popped on about any questions or anything from that. And I can see that it looks like, I believe it may be Paul has just put in about setting expectations early, no nasty surprise for the employers. And that's exactly what we mean in regards to that early engagement. It's always better to be honest with the employer right from the go, because some assessment plans do require a lot of employer interaction, a lot of employer engagement, and a lot of employers to produce evidence to support the apprentice. So it's important that they're aware of that, because if further down the line you have to go to them and say, all right, well, I need you to do 2 observations, I need you to do witness testimony, I need you to do this, I need you to do X, Y, Z, they are going to be reluctant to do any of that. So it's important that you do have that sort of expectation set in session as early as possible throughout the journey.
Craig, Steve here.
Steve.
What you've been through is all the great stuff, and that's fantastic. One of the things that I find that's happened recently due to COVID is we've had this sort of, a lot of small employers have taken on apprentices.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems that a lot of people are facing, and I've done quite a few Ofsted inspections over the last 6 months when Ofsted have been working. And they look at the mentoring side, which you did mention earlier on.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with the smaller organisations is who's going to be the mentor within that organisation. So in some cases, it's quite good to have, if you've got a small employer, someone within your own training organisation who can perhaps add value by being a mentor externally. And by that, I mean, if you've got a good governance committee and you've got external people on that governance committee, you could perhaps ask one of them to be a mentor to that person.
Absolutely.
You know, and they can link up with the employer and the learner and the tutor assessor type person. The other thing I was going to say was about gateway.
Yeah.
And another problem I've noticed is if you've got a good apprentice, and I mean, you know, an apprentice who's really keen and really doing a lot of great stuff in their apprenticeship, and they're really flying high. There is a tendency sometimes for the employer to put more work onto that apprentice and to give them more and more work. And I think it's very key that gateway is used to, if you like, not put the brakes on, but to check, like you were saying about checking stuff, to make sure that they can review and go back and perhaps put them on a more focused pathway to that endpoint assessment, if that makes any sense. I don't know about your thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. And I completely agree with what you're saying, especially in regards to the smaller employers. That is one of the challenges with working with smaller employers, is having those mentors available, because obviously they don't have as many employees. So it does provide its own challenges there. And that is where, sort of, from the provider point of view, you can review it internally and sort of see, what can we do? How can we support this apprentice with that achievement? Is there something that we can do, or someone we can provide to be that mentor, and have that conversation between yourselves and the employer as to the suitability of it? And I think what you were saying there as well, Steve, around the gateway and sort of apprentices being given extra work in a sense because they're too good for in that respect, then yeah, it does absolutely happen. And I think that's one of the vital things when it comes to those review meetings that obviously I was discussing earlier, and sort of those check-ins. It's around sort of opening that conversation in those periods to sort of say, look, it's great that this apprentice is doing so well, and it's great that you want to give them these extra responsibilities, because it means that they are doing exactly what they need to be doing. They're developing well, and they're progressing with their knowledge, skills and behaviours. The downside of that, obviously, like you say, is the lack of, it means then they can't focus on those knowledge, skills and behaviours. They're then having to focus on other tasks and additional bits of information. And that's one of the challenges that would be discussed really within those sort of review meetings, and potentially a gateway when it gets to that stage, is to, right, look, we need to strip it back. We need to focus on these areas, because this is what the apprentice is going to be assessed against. And I get where employers are coming from when they do it, because they do want sort of, let's say, the money's worth out of the apprentice in a sense. And if they can do that job, why not let them do it, and things like that. And I do understand that sort of mindset from an employer perspective, because if the apprentice is able to do it, why not let them? But at the same point, that only draws back on the apprenticeship, because then they're focusing too much on other things and not on those knowledge, skills and behaviours. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Craig. I noticed Sarah was saying about her external mentors. Yeah. I think if you can look at those higher levels, obviously at the higher levels, it's really good to have a mentor that can give that value for money to that apprentice, if that makes sense. And at the same time, it also shows, if you like, value added, if you like, to the employer.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It does. And it shows that if you're able to do that as a provider, it only enhances your reputation with that employer, really, because they are then more trusting, they have more confidence in you, and they feel like I mentioned before, you are the right person to support their apprentice in achieving, because you're able to go over and above in that support. And I think that's one of the vital things that employers look for, is what support can we get, what support can our apprentice get to develop those knowledge, skills and behaviours. And by providing that, I think it's, absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt you both. We've got a bit of a countdown going on the screen at the moment, but I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, Craig, for taking the time out of your busy day to talk to us. Same to yourself, Steve. I hope to catch up with you over a coffee in the very near future. We will now break out into, obviously, the networking tables, where hopefully we continue on with some of the good practice for sharing there. I know Paul and Sarah sort of, hinting sort of things that they're up to at the moment, and good practices. And it'd be great if we could sort of carry on those discussions. So they could be open till sort of 1 o'clock. But thank you all for joining us, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Lovely, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.